Emma Parker stood on the steps of the courthouse, the building looming over her like a shadow from the past. She had been here before, too many times, in fact, but this time was different. This time, she wasn't here to mourn or to beg for answers. She was here to begin the fight her mother had started years ago. Clutching her late mother's leather-bound journal tightly, Emma took a deep breath and stepped inside. Her father, Robert, followed closely behind. The scars of his wrongful conviction were still visible in his cautious demeanor and weary eyes. Though exonerated months ago, the damage had been done. His reputation had been destroyed, their family torn apart, and Marie, Emma's mother, was gone. But Marie hadn't died in vain. Emma was certain of that. Inside the courthouse, the walls were cold and sterile, yet they hummed with the weight of secrets. Emma felt it in her gut. This place wasn't just a center of justice. It was the stage for some of the darkest betrayals in American history. The Heritage Coalition, a secretive network of judges, politicians, and corporate moguls, had turned the justice system into their personal weapon, and her mother had died trying to expose them. "Are you sure about this, Emma?" Robert asked, his voice low but steady. She nodded without hesitation. "Mom left us a trail. She wanted us to find the truth." The journal in her hands was more than just a relic of Marie's meticulous mind. It was a roadmap, filled with cryptic notes, dates, and names that hinted at something far larger than the corruption they'd already uncovered. Emma knew her mother had been onto something massive, something so dangerous that it had gotten her killed. As they walked toward their meeting with Margaret Chen, a Supreme Court clerk who had reached out to them weeks earlier, Emma's thoughts drifted to the stories her mother used to tell her as a child. Marie had always believed in the power of the law, in the idea that justice could prevail if people were brave enough to stand for it. That belief had cost her everything. They entered Margaret's small, cluttered office, where the clerk sat surrounded by stacks of documents. She looked up as they entered, her sharp eyes narrowing behind thick glasses. "Emma Parker," Margaret said, standing to shake her hand. "I've been waiting for this moment. Your mother spoke highly of you." "She knew you?" Emma asked, surprised. Margaret nodded, motioning for them to sit. "Marie and I worked together on several investigations before before everything fell apart. She trusted me with pieces of her findings, but I never had the full picture. I suspect you do." Emma placed the journal on the desk between them. "This is all I have, but I think it's enough to finish what she started." Margaret opened the journal carefully, flipping through the pages filled with Marie's elegant handwriting. Her expression grew darker as she read. "Your mother was chasing something big, bigger than I realize. She believed the Heritage Coalition wasn't just about bribing judges," Emma said. "She thought they were trying to fundamentally reshape the law. But I don't know how." Margaret's face hardened. She was right. "And it's worse than you think." She handed Emma a folder filled with documents, financial records, emails, and memos. Emma scanned them quickly, her stomach sinking with each page. They detailed massive payments made to judges across the country, all tied to a single corporate entity, Marshall Global Industries. "That name keeps coming up," Emma muttered. "Thomas Marshall. He's the CEO, right?" Margaret nodded. "And his father, William Marshall, was a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He's the one who started the Heritage Coalition 30 years ago." Emma's mind raced. If Thomas Marshall was continuing his father's legacy, it meant the corruption went far deeper than they'd imagined. "We need more than this," Robert said, leaning forward. "We need something concrete, something that ties the coalition directly to specific crimes." Margaret hesitated before reaching into her desk and pulling out a sealed envelope. "I've been holding on to this for years. It's a list of judges who were appointed through the coalition's influence. It's not enough to convict anyone, but it's a start." Emma took the envelope, her fingers trembling. "Thank you." As they left Margaret's office, Emma felt the weight of their mission settling onto her shoulders. They had a lead, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. "Where do we go from here?" Robert asked as they exited the courthouse. Emma glanced at the journal in her hands. "Mom left us a trail. We follow it." That night, back in their small apartment, Emma spread the journal and Margaret's documents across the dining table. Robert sat across from her, his expression grim. We need to figure out how Thomas Marshall ties into this, Emma said, circling his name in the journal. If we can prove he's funding the coalition, we can start tearing it apart. Robert nodded. But we have to be careful. If Marshall knows we're onto him, he'll come after us. Emma met his gaze. He's already coming after us. He just doesn't know how close we are to exposing him. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a loud bang echoed from outside. Emma froze, her heart pounding. "Stay here," Robert said, grabbing a flashlight and heading to the door. Emma followed despite his protests, peeking through the window as Robert opened the door cautiously. A black SUV was parked across the street, its engine idling. "Emma," Robert whispered, his voice tight, "get inside. Now." Before she could respond, the SUV sped off, leaving them in tense silence. "They know," Emma said, her voice barely audible. "They're watching us." Robert closed the door and locked it. This just got a lot more dangerous. Emma stared at the journal on the table, her resolve hardening. "Then we don't have time to waste. If Mom could stand up to them, so can we." As the night stretched on, Emma pored over the journal, determined to uncover the truth. She didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. The fight her mother had started wasn't over, and she would see it through, no matter the cost. Emma sat at the dining table, poring over the documents Margaret Chen had provided. Her mother's journal was open beside her, its pages illuminated by the dim light of the lamp. Every scribbled note, every cryptic clue felt like a piece of a puzzle she wasn't sure she was ready to solve. Across from her, Robert stared at his phone, scanning the names of judges linked to the Heritage Coalition. "We need to cross-reference this list with the financial records Margaret gave us," Emma said, her voice steady but her mind racing. "If we can tie specific payments to these judges, we'll have evidence Maxwell can't deny." Robert nodded, but his face was clouded with concern. "Emma, you're leading us straight into dangerous territory. These people won't hesitate to come after you like they did your mom." Emma met his eyes, the determination in her gaze unwavering. "That's exactly why we have to keep going. Mom didn't back down, and neither will I." As they worked late into the night, Emma noticed Carol sitting silently in the corner of the room. She'd been with them since the beginning of their investigation, always willing to lend a hand. But tonight, her energy felt off, tense, distracted. "You okay, Carol?" Emma asked, glancing at her. Carol looked up quickly, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just tired. It's been a long day." Emma nodded, though a strange feeling stirred in her chest. She couldn't shake the thought that Carol seemed nervous. The next morning, Emma and Robert met Alice Bennett at a small cafe on the edge of town. Alice had been crucial to their progress so far, using her insider knowledge of Maxwell's operations to help them uncover critical leads. But Emma couldn't forget the risks of trusting someone who'd once worked for Maxwell. "Margaret's documents are solid," Alice said, stirring her coffee. "But they're not enough. Maxwell's lawyers will claim the payments were routine campaign donations unless you have irrefutable proof of intent." "We're working on it," Robert said. "Emma's mother left us a trail. We just need to follow it." Alice leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Then you'll need to move fast. Maxwell's stepping up his game. His people are watching you." Emma frowned. "How do you know?" Alice hesitated before answering. "Because I've seen them watching me too." The words sent a chill down Emma's spine. They were already under surveillance, but if Maxwell was tightening his grip, the danger was closer than they realized. That evening, Emma and her team prepared to infiltrate the corporate headquarters of Marshall Global Industries. Margaret's documents hinted at hidden financial records stored on the company's servers, records that could provide the proof they needed. The plan was straightforward. Alice would use her credentials to access the building, while Emma and Robert waited nearby to retrieve the data. Carol volunteered to stay outside as a lookout. "Are you sure you're up for this?" Robert asked as they parked a few blocks from the sleek, glass-covered building. Emma nodded. "We don't have a choice. If we don't get these records, Maxwell wins." Alice led the way inside, moving with the confidence of someone who had done this before. Emma marveled at her composure, but a part of her couldn't help wondering how much of Alice's loyalty they could trust. Inside the building, Alice guided Emma and Robert to a secure room containing the servers. Using codes she claimed to have memorized during her time with Maxwell, she unlocked the door and motioned for them to enter. "We don't have much time," Alice said. "Get what you need and get out." Emma sat at the terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She found a folder labeled Judicial Projects and began downloading its contents onto a flash drive. "These files detail the judges Maxwell bought," Emma whispered, her heart racing. "It's all here. Amounts, dates, even the cases they ruled on." Robert kept watch at the door while Alice monitored the security cameras. But something felt wrong. Carol's voice crackled over the earpiece. "Guys, we have a problem," she said. "There's a black SUV parked near the building. I think it's them." Alice cursed under her breath. "They're early. We need to move." Emma finished the download just as the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. The escape was chaotic. Security guards flooded the building, their radios buzzing with instructions to lock everything down. Emma clutched the flash drive as they darted through service corridors, narrowly avoiding detection. "Where's Carol?" Robert asked as they reached the exit. "She was supposed to meet us here," Emma said, glancing around anxiously. But Carol was nowhere to be found. When they finally regrouped back at the safe house, Emma couldn't hide her frustration. "What happened back there, Carol?" she demanded. Carol avoided Emma's gaze, fumbling for an excuse. I got spooked. When I saw the SUV, I panicked and moved the car. I'm sorry." Something about her explanation didn't sit right with Emma. Carol had always been steady under pressure. Why would she suddenly lose her nerve? Later that night, Emma couldn't sleep. The flash drive was their biggest break yet, but the uneasy feeling about Carol lingered. She decided to check the security footage Alice had managed to grab during their infiltration. What she found made her stomach drop. On the footage, Carol was seen outside the building, talking to a man who stepped out of the black SUV. He handed her something, a small envelope, and she nodded before walking away. Emma's chest tightened. Carol hadn't panicked. She had betrayed them. The next morning, Emma confronted Carol. "Do you want to tell me why you were talking to one of Maxwell's men last night?" Emma asked, holding up a still frame from the footage. Carol's face went pale. "Emma, I can explain." "Save it," Emma snapped. "You've been feeding them information, haven't you?" Tears welled in Carol's eyes. "I didn't have a choice. They threatened my family. My sister. They said they'd kill her if I didn't help them." Robert stepped between them, his voice calm but firm. "You should have come to us, Carol. We could have helped." "They're everywhere, Robert," Carol shouted, her voice breaking. "You don't understand how powerful they are. I thought I could keep you safe by steering them away, but I was wrong." Emma took a step back, her hands trembling. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but she knew that wouldn't help. Instead, she took a deep breath and said, "You have one chance to make this right. Tell us everything you know." Carol nodded, her betrayal still fresh but her remorse clear. "I'll help you. I swear. Just don't let them win." As Emma turned to face the flash drive on the table, she realized their fight had just gotten a lot harder. With enemies on all sides and betrayal in their midst, they would have to be smarter, faster, and more determined than ever. The battle for justice had only just begun. Emma sat by the window of the safe house, staring at her mother's journal as the early morning light filtered through the blinds. The betrayal from Carol still weighed heavily on her, but Emma forced herself to focus on the task at hand. The flash drive they had stolen from Marshall Global Industries was a treasure trove of evidence, but Maxwell's influence ran deep. They needed something even stronger, something irrefutable. Robert entered the room, holding 2 cups of coffee. He placed one in front of Emma, his expression a mix of exhaustion and concern. "You haven't slept," he said. "I can't," Emma replied. "There's too much at stake." Robert sat across from her, watching as she flipped through the journal. "You're not just looking for evidence, are you? You're looking for her." Emma hesitated, then nodded. "What if Mom didn't die that night? What if she survived?" "Emma." "She was too smart, Dad," Emma interrupted, her voice firm. "Everything in this journal points to her knowing they were coming for her. What if she had a contingency plan? What if she found a way out?" Robert sighed, rubbing his temples. "I want to believe that as much as you do. But we buried her, Emma. We saw her body. Emma didn't reply. She wanted to believe her father, but a part of her couldn't let go of the possibility that her mother had somehow escaped. The clues were there, hidden between the lines of her mother's writing. One entry in particular stood out. If they come for me, follow the star. That afternoon, Emma and Robert met Alice at a secluded park. The tension from Carol's betrayal was still palpable, but Alice remained focused on the mission. The flash drive gave us plenty of leads, Alice said, handing Emma a tablet. But there's one file that caught my attention. It's encrypted, but the metadata mentions a contingency asset. That could be your mother. Emma's heart skipped a beat. What do we need to decrypt it? A key, Alice replied. And I think your mother left it for you. Emma opened the journal again, pointing to the phrase, follow the star. She wrote this a few days before she died. Do you think it's a code? Alice leaned over the journal, studying the handwriting. It's possible. Where was she when she wrote this? Robert answered immediately. The Charleston Observatory. She used to go there to clear her head. Emma nodded, feeling a spark of hope. Then that's where we're going. The observatory was quiet, its halls echoing with the sound of their footsteps. Emma's mother had loved this place, often bringing her here as a child to look at the stars. It felt surreal to be back, chasing clues her mother had left behind. Where would she have hidden it? Robert asked, glancing around. Emma walked to the telescope her mother always used, running her fingers along the base. She felt a small indentation and pressed it. A compartment popped open, revealing a small USB drive. Got it, Emma said. Holding it up, Alice plugged the drive into her laptop, quickly bypassing the simple security measures. A file labeled for Emma appeared. As they opened it, a video began to play. Marie Parker's face filled the screen, her expression calm but serious. If you're watching this, it means I didn't make it, she began. But it also means you followed the trail I left for you. Emma, if anyone can finish what I started, it's you. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Seeing her mother again, even in a video, felt like a punch to the chest. By now, you've realized that the Heritage Coalition isn't just about bribing judges. It's about control over laws, over rights, over people. And they'll stop at nothing to protect that control. Marie's voice grew sharper. But I found something they didn't want me to see. A plan. A list of cases they've been shaping for decades, all leading to one goal. Changing the Constitution itself. She paused, her gaze softening. Emma, I'm sorry for everything I've put you through, but I know you're strong enough to see this through. Inside this drive is the key to exposing them. But you'll need help. Trust Alice. She's more than she seems. Marie looked down for a moment, her voice trembling. And Emma, I love you. Never forget that. The screen went dark. The room was silent for a long moment. She knew, Emma said softly. She knew they were coming for her. Robert put a hand on her shoulder. And she trusted you to finish what she started. Alice cleared her throat, breaking the silence. The drive also contains coordinates. It looks like a storage facility outside Charleston. That must be where she hid the evidence. Emma nodded, her resolve hardening. Then that's where we're going next. As they drove toward the storage facility, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The events of the past few days had made her hyper-aware of every shadow, every strange car. We're close, Alice said from the passenger seat, checking the GPS. Suddenly, the SUV swerved as a black car sped past them, cutting them off. Armed men emerged, guns drawn. Get down, Robert shouted, hitting the brakes. The men opened fire, bullets shattering the windshield. Emma scrambled out of the car with the journal clutched tightly in her arms. Alice returned fire, her movements precise and calculated. Robert pulled Emma behind the car, shielding her as the gunfight intensified. They found us, Alice said, reloading her weapon. No kidding. Robert snapped. Emma's mind raced. They couldn't afford to lose the journal or the drive. If Maxwell's men got their hands on them, everything her mother had worked for would be lost. Go, Alice shouted. I'll cover you. Emma hesitated, but Robert pulled her toward the tree line. We have to move now. They ran through the dense woods, the sound of gunfire fading behind them. Emma's heart pounded as she clutched the journal to her chest, willing herself to keep going. Finally, they emerged onto a dirt road, where a lone car sat waiting. Carol was behind the wheel, her face pale but determined. "Get in," she shouted. Emma froze, unsure if she could trust her, but Robert pushed her forward. "We don't have a choice." They climbed into the car, and Carol sped off, glancing nervously in the rearview mirror. "I heard the gunfire," she said. "Figured you'd need help." Emma didn't reply. She still wasn't sure where Carol's loyalties lay, but for now, they needed her. As the car disappeared into the night, Emma looked down at the journal in her lap. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "You're strong enough to see this through." For the first time, Emma truly believed it. The narrow dirt road stretched out before them as Carol drove the car deeper into the South Carolina backwoods. The air inside the vehicle was heavy with tension, the recent gunfight still fresh in everyone's minds. Emma sat in the back seat, clutching her mother's journal as if it were a lifeline. Robert sat beside her, his jaw tight, while Alice sat in the passenger seat, her sharp eyes scanning the trees for any sign of pursuit. "We need to get off the main roads," Alice said, her voice calm but urgent. "They'll have more men looking for us." Carol nodded. "I know a place nearby. An old cabin my family used to rent. It's off the grid." Emma exchanged a glance with her father. Despite Carol's recent betrayal, her actions during the ambush suggested she was trying to make amends. For now, they had no choice but to trust her. As the car bounced along the uneven road, Emma's mind churned. The video from her mother had revealed far more than she'd expected. The Heritage Coalition's ultimate goal wasn't just corruption. It was rewriting the very foundation of the legal system. And now, with Maxwell and his network closing in, Emma knew they were running out of time to expose the truth. "We're here," Carol announced, pulling up to a small, dilapidated cabin hidden among the trees. They filed out of the car, each of them moving cautiously. The cabin was old but sturdy, its weathered wooden walls blending into the forest. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and pine. Alice secured the windows while Robert checked the perimeter. Emma set the journal and flash drive on the table, her mind racing as she tried to piece together their next move. "We need to decrypt the rest of the files from the flash drive," Emma said. "If Mom left us the coordinates to that storage unit, then whatever's inside must be the final piece of the puzzle." Alice nodded. "I can work on decrypting it, but it'll take time. And if Maxwell's men show up again, we won't stand a chance without a plan." Carol crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "I know people, activists, reporters, who'd want to help. If we can get this story out to them, we might be able to buy some time." Robert frowned. "No offense, but the last time you worked with someone outside the group, it didn't end well." Carol's face tightened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned to Emma. "I'm trying to make this right. Let me help." Emma hesitated, then nodded. "Reach out to them, but keep it quiet. No phones, no emails. Use burner numbers if you have to." Carol nodded and stepped outside to make the arrangements. Hours later, the group sat around the small table, the decrypted files from the flash drive glowing on Alice's laptop screen. Emma leaned forward, her eyes scanning the data. "This is it," Alice said, pointing to a document marked Judicial Network Strategy. "It's a blueprint for everything the coalition's been working toward. They've been planting cases in lower courts, steering them toward specific judges to create new precedents. They're reshaping constitutional law one ruling at a time." Emma's stomach churned as she read. The cases ranged from corporate tax loopholes to voting rights and environmental protections. Each one had been carefully orchestrated to erode protections and consolidate power for a select few. "They've been doing this for decades," Robert said, his voice grim. "And no one noticed?" "They noticed," Alice replied. "But anyone who got too close either joined them or disappeared." Emma's fingers hovered over the screen, her gaze narrowing on a name she recognized. "Thomas Marshall. He's at the center of all this." Alice nodded. "And not just him. Look at the financial records." Emma clicked through to another folder, revealing a web of payments and bribes. The money flowed through shell companies and offshore accounts, all tied back to Marshall Global Industries. "This is the smoking gun," Emma said. "If we can tie these payments to the judges on the coalition's list, We can prove everything. Not yet, Alice warned. We need the files from the storage unit. Without that, this is just circumstantial. The next morning, the group packed up and set out for the storage facility. Carol had managed to contact a group of independent journalists willing to broadcast the story if they could provide hard evidence. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The storage facility was located on the outskirts of Charleston, a nondescript building surrounded by a chain-link fence. Emma's mother's coordinates led them to Unit 23, a rusted metal door with a simple lock. Emma's hands trembled as she unlocked it, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Inside, the unit was filled with filing cabinets, boxes, and an old computer tower. Emma's eyes scanned the labels on the boxes: Judicial Cases 1994 to 2005, Coalition Funding, Media Manipulation Strategy. "This is it," Emma whispered. Alice immediately began photographing the documents while Robert rifled through the cabinets. Emma focused on the computer tower, hoping it would still work. As the computer powered on, a video file appeared on the desktop labeled for Emma. She clicked it, and once again, her mother's face appeared on the screen. "Emma," Marie said, her voice soft but resolute, "if you found this, you've uncovered everything. But there's one last thing you need to know." Marie's expression grew somber. Thomas Marshall isn't the only one behind this. The coalition was created by his father, but it's been sustained by powerful allies, people in Congress, corporate executives, even within law enforcement. To expose them, you'll need to go public. Show the world everything. It's the only way. Emma felt tears welling in her eyes as her mother's image flickered. "And Emma, I believe in you. Always." The video ended, leaving the room in silence. "We have what we need," Alice said, breaking the stillness. "Now, we just have to get it out before they find us." As they loaded the files into the car, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Her instincts were confirmed when a black SUV pulled into the lot, its headlights cutting through the early evening haze. "Go!" Alice shouted, drawing her weapon. Emma dove into the back seat as Robert hit the gas. The SUV roared after them, its tires screeching against the pavement. "They're gaining on us," Carol shouted from the passenger seat. Alice leaned out the window, firing at their pursuers. Emma clutched the files tightly, her heart pounding. "Hold on," Robert yelled, swerving onto a narrow side road. The chase was chaotic, the SUV relentless in its pursuit. Emma's mind raced, desperate for a solution. Then she remembered her mother's words. "Go public." "Head toward the city," Emma said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "What?" Robert asked. "Take us to the journalists Carol contacted. If we can't shake them, we'll expose everything right in front of them." Robert hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Hold on tight." As the car sped toward downtown Charleston, Emma felt a strange sense of calm. The truth was out there now, waiting to be revealed. All they had to do was survive long enough to share it. The streets of downtown Charleston buzzed with life as Robert's car barreled through the narrow roads. Emma sat in the back seat, clutching her mother's journal and the files from the storage unit as the black SUV closed in behind them. The weight of the evidence was tangible in her lap, and she knew the moment they reached their destination, everything would change. "They're not backing off," Carol shouted, her voice sharp with panic. "They won't," Alice replied from the passenger seat, her gun resting on the dashboard. "This is their last chance to stop us." Emma's eyes darted to the laptop balanced on her knees. The files her mother had compiled were ready to upload to the independent journalists waiting for them. If they could get there. Robert took a hard left, the tires screeching as he narrowly avoided colliding with a food truck. "Emma, are you sure about this? Going public like this, it's dangerous." Emma met his eyes in the rearview mirror, her voice steady. "It's the only way, Dad. If we try to do this quietly, they'll find us before we can expose anything. We have to make it loud enough that they can't silence us." Alice leaned out of the window, firing at the SUV's tires. The sharp crack of gunfire echoed through the streets, but the SUV swerved, dodging the bullets. "They're too well trained," Alice muttered, pulling back inside. "Then we outrun them," Robert said, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Emma, get ready. We're 5 minutes out." The rendezvous point was a small, independent news station located in an unassuming brick building near the harbor. Carol had coordinated with a group of journalists who specialized in exposing corruption, people who wouldn't hesitate to broadcast the evidence Emma carried. But as they approached, Emma spotted two more black SUVs parked nearby. "They're here," she said, her stomach twisting. Carol swore under her breath. "They're moving faster than we thought." Robert slowed the car, pulling into an alley behind the station. "We need a new plan. We can't just walk in the front door with them watching." Emma stared at the building, her mind racing. Then she noticed the fire escape leading up to the roof. "We'll split up," she said. "Alice and I will take the files and through the roof. Dad, you and Carol draw their attention at the front entrance." "No way," Robert said immediately. "I'm not leaving you alone with this." Emma looked at him, her eyes fierce. "You taught me how to fight, how to stay calm under pressure. Trust me, Dad. We don't have a choice." Robert hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Be careful." Emma and Alice climbed the fire escape, moving quickly but quietly. Below, Robert and Carol approached the front of the building, deliberately drawing the attention of the men in black suits who guarded the entrance. Emma could hear shouting as she reached the roof. She glanced down and saw her father raising his hands in mock surrender, loudly demanding to speak to the journalists inside. "Let's move," Alice said, pulling Emma's focus back to the task at hand. They slipped through an open window into the station's control room, where two journalists were hunched over a console, their faces pale. "Who are you?" one of them demanded, standing quickly. Emma held up the journal and the flash drive. "We're the reason they're out there," she said, jerking her thumb toward the chaos below. "And we have the story you've been waiting for." The journalists scrambled into action, connecting the flash drive to their system. As the files uploaded, Emma quickly explained the Heritage Coalition's conspiracy. The decades of judicial corruption, the corporate bribes, and their ultimate goal of reshaping constitutional law. "This is enough to blow the entire system wide open," one of the journalists said, his eyes wide as he scanned the files. "But we need time to verify." "You don't have time," Alice interrupted. "They're already here. If you don't broadcast this now, you may never get another chance." The journalist hesitated, then nodded. "We'll go live in 5 minutes." Emma felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. "They're coming up the stairs," Alice said, glancing at the door. "We need to buy more time." Alice barricaded the door with a heavy filing cabinet, then turned to Emma. "Stay here and make sure this goes out. I'll handle them." Emma grabbed her arm. "You can't take them alone." "I've dealt with worse," Alice said, her voice firm. "Trust me." Before Emma could argue, Alice slipped out of the room, her weapon drawn. The journalists worked frantically, setting up the live broadcast. Emma watched as the files began to appear on the screen, each one a damning piece of evidence against the coalition. 30 seconds, one of them said. Emma's heart pounded as she heard gunfire echoing through the building. She forced herself to focus, knowing that if they succeeded, it would all be worth it. The broadcast began. The journalists spoke with urgency, laying out the evidence as images of documents and videos filled the screen. Emma's mother's video played, her calm, determined voice echoing across the airwaves. "This is the truth they tried to bury," Marie said. "But the truth has a way of coming to light." Tears pricked Emma's eyes as she watched her mother's words reach the world. For the first time, she felt the weight of the fight lift, replaced by a flicker of hope. But the danger wasn't over. The door burst open, and one of Maxwell's men stormed in, his weapon raised. Emma froze, her body tensing as he aimed at the journalists. Before he could fire, a shot rang out. The man collapsed, and Alice stepped into the room, her face streaked with sweat but determined. "Broadcast still going?" she asked. Emma nodded. "We did it." By the time the broadcast ended, police and federal agents had swarmed the building. The men Maxwell had sent were taken into custody, and the journalists promised to keep the story alive. Emma stood outside, watching as the evidence spread across the city. People were gathering, their phones lighting up with notifications about the broadcast. Robert and Carol joined her, both of them looking relieved but exhausted. "You did it, kid," Robert said, pulling her into a hug. Emma held onto him tightly, the enormity of what they'd accomplished sinking in. But she knew it wasn't over. "We exposed the coalition," she said, pulling back. "But we still need to take down Maxwell and Marshall. They won't stop until they're behind bars." Alice stepped beside her, her expression grim. "And they're not going to fight fair." Emma nodded, her jaw tightening. "Neither will we." As the crowd outside the station grew, Emma felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. The truth was out. Now, it was time to finish what her mother started. The broadcast had set the world ablaze. Overnight, the Heritage Coalition's secrets were exposed to millions, sparking protests, investigations, and a public outcry unlike anything Emma had ever seen. Social media trended with hashtags like #JusticeForMarie and #HeritageExposed, while news networks debated the implications of the corruption that had infiltrated America's judiciary. But for Emma and her team, the broadcast was just the beginning. Inside the safe house, the mood was tense but resolute. Emma sat at the kitchen table, poring over her mother's journal and the files they had recovered. Her father, Robert, stood nearby, his arms crossed as he watched her with a mixture of pride and concern. Carol was at the window, keeping watch, while Alice cleaned her weapon at the counter. "Marshall's next," Emma said firmly, breaking the silence. Robert leaned in. "You're sure about this?" Emma looked up, her eyes burning with determination. "The coalition's network is crumbling, but Marshall's the linchpin. He's the one funding everything, the bribes, the judges, the smear campaigns. If we take him down, the rest will collapse." Alice nodded, her expression grim. "He won't go down quietly. Marshall Global Industries is a fortress. He'll have private security, off-the-books operatives, and connections in law enforcement." Emma met her gaze. "Then we'll need to be smarter than him." Later that day, Alice returned with information she had managed to extract from the men who had been captured during the broadcast ambush. Marshall was holding a private fundraiser that evening in Atlanta, a gathering of corporate elites, politicians, and judges who were still loyal to the coalition. "He's consolidating power," Alice explained, spreading a map of the venue across the table. "The broadcast rattled him, but it's not enough to stop him. He's doubling down, pulling strings to keep his network intact." Emma traced her finger along the map, her mind working quickly. "If we can get into that fundraiser, we can confront him directly, show the evidence to his allies, and force them to abandon him." "Too risky," Robert said. "He'll have the place locked down. It'll be crawling with security." Emma tapped the table. "That's why we make him come to us. We lure him out." Alice raised an eyebrow. "And how do you plan to do that?" Emma opened her mother's journal to a marked page. Mom wrote about Marshall's biggest weakness, his ego. "He won't back down from a public challenge. If we call him out in front of his supporters, he'll feel compelled to respond." Carol crossed her arms. "And if he doesn't?" Emma's jaw tightened. "Then we force his hand." As night fell, Emma and her team prepared to execute their plan. Carol contacted a trusted journalist who agreed to help stage a live press event outside the fundraiser. The journalist's crew set up cameras and lights, ready to broadcast the moment Emma exposed Marshall's crimes to the world. Emma stood in the center of the safe house, her team gathered around her. She wore a black hoodie and jeans, her mother's journal tucked securely into her backpack. "This isn't just about Marshall," Emma said, addressing them. "It's about every family that's been torn apart by the coalition's corruption. It's about making sure they can never do this again." Robert placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're with you, Emma, no matter what." The fundraiser was held in a sprawling mansion surrounded by tall iron gates and patrolled by armed guards. Inside, guests mingled in opulent rooms, sipping champagne and discussing the fallout from the broadcast. Marshall stood at the center of the main hall, exuding confidence as he reassured his allies that the coalition's influence would endure. But outside, the atmosphere was very different. Emma stood in front of the cameras, the bright lights illuminating her determined face. Behind her, a growing crowd of protesters held signs and chanted slogans demanding justice. The journalist began the broadcast, her voice clear and steady. "We're live outside the Marshall fundraiser, where Emma Parker, the young woman who exposed the Heritage Coalition, has a message for one of the most powerful men in America." Emma stepped forward, her heart pounding. She held her mother's journal in one hand and a microphone in the other. "Thomas Marshall," she began, her voice carrying over the crowd. "I know you're watching this. You've spent decades hiding behind your wealth and power, using corrupt judges and politicians to manipulate the system. But your time is up." She held up a copy of the files they had recovered. "We have the evidence, every bribe, every crime, every family you destroyed to build your empire. The world knows what you've done, and we're not afraid of you." Inside the mansion, Marshall froze as he watched the broadcast on a large screen. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. "She's bluffing," one of his advisors said. Marshall's eyes narrowed. "No, she's not." Outside, Emma continued. "If you have any shred of decency left, you'll come out here and face the truth. Or are you too much of a coward to answer for your crimes?" The crowd erupted in cheers, their chants growing louder. Marshall clenched his fists, his face darkening. He knew he couldn't ignore this challenge without appearing weak. "Send a team to clear them out," he ordered. His advisor hesitated. "If we use force, it'll only make us look worse." Marshall glared at him. "Then I'll handle it myself." The gates of the mansion creaked open, and Marshall emerged, flanked by 2 bodyguards. The crowd parted as he approached the cameras, his expression a mask of controlled fury. "You've made a grave mistake, young lady," he said, his voice cold and measured. Emma met his gaze, unflinching. "The only mistake I made was thinking men like you could be stopped quietly. But now the world sees you for who you really are." Marshall smirked, his confidence returning. "You think a few documents and a sob story are enough to bring me down? I've survived worse than you." Emma stepped closer, holding up her mother's journal. "This isn't just about me. It's about my mother. You killed her because she found out what you and your father were doing. But she left behind something you didn't count on, the truth." The journalist interjected, pointing to the camera. "Mr. Marshall, do you deny the allegations against you? The bribes, the manipulation of the courts, the role you played in Marie Parker's murder?" Marshall's mask cracked for a split second, but he quickly composed himself. "I deny everything. This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to tarnish my reputation." Emma didn't let up. "Then explain the files, the payments, the emails. Explain the judges you've bought and the laws you've broken. Go ahead, Thomas. Defend yourself." The crowd waited, the tension thick in the air. But Marshall said nothing. In that moment, Emma realized she had already won. The silence spoke louder than any confession. The cameras captured every second of his hesitation, every flicker of doubt in his carefully crafted facade. Marshall turned and stormed back toward the mansion, but the damage was done. The crowd roared, their chants of justice echoing into the night. Emma exhaled, her heart pounding with exhilaration and relief. For the first time, she felt the tide turning in their favor. But as she looked at the mansion, she knew this wasn't over. Marshall had retreated, but he wasn't defeated. Not yet.